Welcome, everyone, and thank you for your patience with the technology glitch that we just experienced. Our resident disaster expert, Dr. Brymer, who I'm going to introduce in a moment, said this is a sign of how we need to be prepared for anything. This team has been really resourceful in getting this webinar going. Thank you. I am really, really thrilled to introduce Dr. Melissa Brymer, who is internationally known for her work as an expert in mental health interventions in the wake of disaster. She is currently the director of the Terrorism and Disaster Program for the UCLA Duke University National Center for Child Traumatic Stress and its National Child Traumatic Stress Network. That network is made up of 200 centers across the US whose mission is to raise the standard of care and increase access to trauma services for children and their families. And in that capacity, she's been involved with the development of acute interventions, assessment, and educational materials in the area of disasters, terrorism, and school crises. She's also a researcher with us here at the Geffen School of Medicine, and she's conducted large-scale research projects examining the effectiveness of trauma treatments after disaster. She studied the trajectory of disaster recovery in youth and adults. She's looked at the short and long-term impact of mass violence on communities and assessed the impact of COVID-19 on traumatized and bereaved young people. She's the primary author of the National Center on Trauma, Child Traumatic Stress's Psychological First Aid and Skills for Psychological Recovery. She served as a consultant for many federal, state, and local agencies across the country and internationally after disasters, terrorism, school shootings, and other mass violence tragedies, and after public health emergencies. She's someone that the federal government regularly calls, FBI regularly calls in the wake of disasters. She was the lead advisor to the Newton Public Schools and conducted the evaluation of recovery efforts after the Sandy Hook tragedy as just one example. And she's serving as the PI for the California Together for Wellness Juntos website to promote the mental health and well-being of youth, young adults, and those who serve that population. So she's incredibly accomplished. Most recently, she stepped in as our wellness officer for the Department of Psychiatry and Semel Institute. And this was only 3 months ago. I don't think any of us knew exactly how timely her taking on that role would be. She has now stepped up to the plate to really be the person who is the primary consultant on mental health interventions in the wake of the wildfires here in LA and the multiple other unanticipated events that we've been experiencing this month, not only for our department, but for all of the School of Medicine and now for the entire university. So it's just such an honor to have her talking with us now based on her multiple decades of experience working on mental health in the wake of disaster, about how we can promote healing here amongst ourselves in the wake of all of the tragedies that we've been experiencing. So thanks so much, Dr. Brymer, for speaking with us and for doing what you do.
Thanks, everybody. And I appreciate doing this work is really important. Doing it in your own community has a special connection. And I start on my slide, you might see on the left hand, a artist that I worked with who was a counselor in Paradise had decided that because there were so many home cars that were destroyed, she asked everyone from Paradise, give me your keys. And from that, she created this phoenix to show that there's rising, to show that there's hope. Through art, we can really be thinking about how do we think from very different angles how to do this work. You'll see that the phoenix has some keys in its mouth. Those were for from any of those that from the 85 people who died in that tragedy, as well as some of her own family that were impacted. But I just, there's some lessons learned from other disasters, whether it's from Paradise or our work from Lahaina that you'll hear me talking about. And I also understand that many people in our own department have also been impacted by this event. And so this is personal, this is real, and we're really wanting to make sure, what do we do collectively as an institution to support not only the wellness for ourselves, but the wellness for our community as well. So I just want to, I do want to make sure that I'm part of the Child Trauma Network, and the National Center for Child Traumatic Stress is actually based here out of UCLA. We're co-located at UCLA and Duke University. That partnership usually goes well, except for basketball season, then it gets a little bit tense. But we have 208 centers across the country, and our mission is to improve the access and quality of care for children and families who have been impacted by trauma. And I lead up our disaster initiatives. And so some of the talks that I'm going to be speaking about is the work that we do nationally and how we can bring it in here. I do need to acknowledge that this talk is not on any federal dollars, that I understand there's some regulation changes, but it's also important that we bring up these some of the elements that are critical right now in our work, even though there might be some federal changes. So I am not on any federal dollars as we speak. And so what I wanted to first is that when we're thinking about the wildfires, they don't come in isolation. We need to be thinking about what are some of the exposures, some of the vulnerabilities of our community, and what hazards have actually already played into some of our communities that may influence how people respond now and in the long-term recovery. And so we can't have this talk without acknowledging and understanding how climate change is impacting both health and mental health and the inequities. And so we do need to think about the rising temperatures, the increasing of CO2 levels, the extreme weather, the rising sea levels, and how that's degrading living conditions, inequities in many different communities. And how some of these environmental degradations are influencing what we're hearing in some of those communities, even here in LA, on how they've been impacted. I really felt that why we need to be talking about climate change and how it influences here. We're seeing, because of the global temperature changes, we're seeing an increase of extreme weather events, whether it's through wildfires. I'm a New England girl. Wildfires were something that we just experienced, which we never experienced in Connecticut, Massachusetts. So we're seeing populations that never experienced wildfires or flooding that are now experiencing that. So we know that there are direct impacts. There is the injury, the mortalities, the loss of life, the loss of property, the loss of land and some of the natural impacts, but also the air population and those environmental challenges. We know we're just at the beginning of this disaster. We know there's long-term impacts when we're thinking about when we have these types of disasters, that there tends to be inequities on that rebuilding. There's disruptions to sometimes some of our service systems, including our health systems, disruptions of food supplies, or some of these things that are really some of those basic needs. And that there's sometimes a breakdown in community. Not everyone's going to have the same idea of how to rebuild or those priority areas, and those shifts can really make a difference, as well as many who have heard about climate change, might have not paid attention to it, are now paying attention to it because of the damage and the impact that we're seeing from these. And as you see, there's massive mental health and well-being impacts. Sometimes we only focus on PTSD, but that's just one arm, as you can see here. We know, and the data is showing, that with increased temperatures, there's actually a correlation with suicide rates increasing, sleep issues, substance use, grief, and some of these other areas that you'll hear me talking about. And so it's important that we pay attention to these things, as well as not everybody in our community has the same types of needs. And so the CMIST framework is one of these frameworks that the government created to have us think about who in our population may need additional supports for communication. They might have language needs. They might, for the deaf and hard of hearing, they might need either devices or ASL. Some people are needing additional supports to maintain their health when these events happen. To maintain their independence, they might depend on certain devices or assisted equipment to help them. I was working in a one distribution site, and this woman had a wheelchair. It was electronic, but she didn't have her charger, and the charger burnt down. So we need to be thinking about how do some of these folks that have these access and functional needs, if we don't have proper planning, we know that there's additional vulnerabilities, including those who have safety or support or need extra services, for those that might have a pre-existing psychiatric condition or addiction issues or past traumas, and those that have challenges of who are unable to drive themselves and may have limitations on transportation. When these needs aren't met prior to a disaster happening, they get exacerbated afterwards. So it's really important that we think about in our community, are there additional risks as we think about these issues? The EAP has really done extensive work on kind of like, are there vulnerable groups that we know of? And when we're thinking about disaster work, and it's really clear that there really are 4 true social groups that are vulnerable. Those that are living in low income, communities of color, those with lower education, and our seniors. And so what does that mean? Many times, communities of color with low income populations are more likely to be living in these impacted areas. They're more likely to actually sustain property damage, employment disruptions, income disruptions, have that lack of ability to evacuate, have difficulty accessing aid, or that required documentation that's needed to help with that repairing. And there's typically, we're seeing in disaster response and recovery, delays for response recovery. We know that there's social and health inequities. These are exacerbated in disasters. So then that we are seeing that these groups are suffering more long-term health and mental health impacts. And we're seeing mortality for things that actually are preventable. So it's really important when we're doing disaster work that we focus on some of these vulnerable groups. What are those ways that we're providing that type of support? So as we kind of go through and thinking about disaster response, when I do this work, there are certain key concepts that I keep in mind. All of us did not go through these wildfires in the same way. And so there are certain things that make folks more at risk. So first of all, dose of exposure matters. That means those who have had direct impact to the fires. We know that after wildfires, those who had to flee their homes under life threat, that's very different than those that had additional time to pack their things, get their belongings, and leave. Those who have experienced that loss of life, and you know, I'm a kid person. Many families' loss of life is also that pet loss that happened, plus their loss of possessions, whether that's their home, their workplaces. Those kind of direct impacts matter. But we know in disaster work, there's a lot of things that play out afterwards that we really need to be paying attention to. And that's that secondary adversities. Things aren't over for those who are most impacted. They're still making choices. Businesses are deciding, you know, can they actually sustain their business, and they might have to shut down. There may be health implications going on. There's making choices. Do I live in the area and stay connected to those that I care about, or can I actually financially not stay in this area and I might have to move. So some of these secondary adversities need to be thought through in how that's impacting someone's healing journey. Dr. Pinus, my mentor, one of the things that he really emphasizes and that we promote is that sometimes when we talk about disasters, we throw terms together and we think that they're interchangeable. But I do want to stop a minute in that there's a difference between trauma and grief. And why I'm actually talking about that differently is that there's different trajectories for those who have experienced the trauma of the wildfires and those who also experienced the loss of a loved one. When we're talking about the death of a loved one, the permanency of that, for me to say you're going to be resilient, you're going to bounce back, you're going to be treated by that grief, those terms don't fit into for somebody who has lost a loved one. We've all experienced some type of loss. As I mentioned that right now, there's a part of you that's now thinking about that loved one. They're always a piece of that we want to honor, we want to make meaning, we want to adjust our lives because of how they mentored us and supported us. We don't bounce back from that. There's a part that we still hold on to. And so it's really important that we actually think about and make sure that our work that we're doing both honors the grief elements that members of our community are experiencing, as well as that trauma piece. And we know that there can be different trauma and loss reminders that play out. So there can be my loved one who just passed away, when their birthday comes up. I know that I'm going to be thinking about those times that they brought up for me. Trauma reminders are those things that remind us about that disaster. So it could be seeing the charred land. Some of our residents are getting to go back to their property and seeing the devastation. When we are going about our day and all of a sudden we hear fire trucks go by, we're probably wondering, is there another fire going on? When our alert systems go off, those things are part of that trauma reminder. And so we do need to be acknowledging how those reminders are interfering with our emotional state and as well as our functioning. And appreciate that what trauma and loss experiences people might have had in the past that might be influencing how they're responding here. There's a lot of different psychological reactions that we can, as you can imagine, that when we're dealing with disasters, there is the grief, the post-traumatic reactions, the panic that we're seeing. We're also hearing some depression and kind of feeling stuck right now. But we also know that some of these reactions that can also be opportunities. I've also seen some folks thinking about, I want to make a change. And so sometimes we're seeing people get activated by some of their responses. And how do I make changes as it relates to some of the things that I'm seeing right now? And that we have to think about the developmental consequences of these disasters. As I'm a kid person, we're really looking at those seniors right now who may not be able to graduate in the buildings where they spent most of their lives. They're in the middle of making those choices of going college career, work career. Some of that might be influenced or impacted right now. How do we make sure that we create support systems to help them with those disappointments? Is there ways that we can make sure that we minimize as much as possible some of those developmental consequences? And when we're thinking about disaster work, there's certain things that we all keep in mind. And one of these is that as adults who are also parents in the room or on this talk, we have this assumption that we can protect our families at all costs. Well, this disaster challenges that belief. And we also feel like there's this expectation that our community can protect us. And when that social contract, and when we start to see potential violations of assumptions that we're making, there can be, this can create additional heartache and hurt when they might feel like there's been disproportionate supports for different communities, or that something could have been done and it wasn't done. We're going to see some of those when those violations come out as we look at kind of those investigations. We know that that's going to play out in how we provide this kind of support. And because of the increases of climate change, as well as kind of other disruptions that are going on, we also have to acknowledge that there's compound events happening right now, and that sometimes they're not all environmental, but we have to acknowledge that some of the governmental changes and policy changes are influencing our workforce, our community, and that we have to, this compound events that are happening is taking a toll, and that we have to actually take that into account of how this, how we have to adjust what we're doing, with that acknowledgement that some of these policy practices that are policies that are being potentially put into place are harming certain groups in our community differentially. And so when I do this work, there's many of us that came together a few years ago, and we looked at the research, and we looked at those of us who have done this disaster work. And there's really kind of 5 principles that we keep in mind when we're doing this, whether it's in this short term or whether we're in this long-term recovery. And the first is, these kind of disasters impact our sense of safety, whether it's physical safety, which we experienced in that first week, but it also could be perceived safety right now. So we have members of our community who may not feel safe right now to get services because they're afraid that that could actually jeopardize their legal status in the US. There may be moving to a new community where I don't know my neighbors, I don't know who I can trust. Those pieces of safety can really have an influence on how do we provide supports right now from that behavioral health perspective. 6 months down the line, the data is really clear. There's, as I was showing in one of those earlier slides, that in disaster work, other types of safety concerns pick up. We know that suicide risk increases. We understand that violence and abuse increases 6 months out. If I'm not my best self, I'm actually stressed all the time, I'm not sleeping. You can see why altercations turn into abuse or violence. And so we do need to be thinking about what are those elements that we're putting into place to actually mitigate some of these reactions that we know happen after disasters. After a disaster, there are those psychological reactions that I was talking about before. One of those that we don't spend enough on that's actually longest lasting is sleep disruptions. So many of us, and probably some of you in this room, are probably like, my sleep isn't as restful. As soon as I put my head on my pillow, I'm starting to ruminate and thinking about everything that's going on, or I'm waking up more frequently. We do need to be thinking about how do we actually attend to those sleep issues, so that if our bodies aren't resting as we're needing to, that actually has longer term consequences. The data is really clear that one of the most protective factors is when we have supports around us. Disasters tend to disrupt our support systems, whether I've had to move out, whether I'm so overwhelmed that I'm not using them. And I think it's important that as we've been doing this work, we've actually spent more time not just about connectedness, but also asking ourselves about belongingness. If I stop working at this institution, will anyone know that I'm no longer here? That sense of feeling of belongingness, that I matter, whether it's in this work community are in our communities that we work in is really, really important. And with some of the current legislative changes, people are truly feeling, am I accepted in my community anymore? And so thinking about how to make sure that we're thinking both on that community level and that individual level, creating messages, support, so that that belongingness is part of the work that we're doing. The fourth concept that we really hone in on is that everyone that I work with, every community, every culture, they have a strength. And so part of the what we need to be doing is embracing those strengths. We've heard from Altadena, from the Palisades, that there's beautiful connections that are and things that people are holding on to. How do we grab onto those, support them, so that we can keep some of those community traditions together and increase them as we're moving forward? And that last piece is hope. So when we're thinking about hope, how do we, I can't tell people what their path's going to be, but we can dig into when we've had difficult times in the past, what helped us then. We can learn from different communities, such as from Paradise and Lahaina. What were some of those strategies that helped you to get to that next level? Helping folks anchor on those pieces that they actually have control over can help them to have that agency that they can make a difference, and they can actually create this journey. And it's really important that each community is able to make meaning of what, how this disaster has impacted them, how they want to be recognized for this. And that's all part of that hope piece. When we do this work, we really do it from a public health approach. And we really are looking at that there has to be tiers of intervention, that there's not going to be a one size that fits all for everybody. That universal is those general, what are those messages, supports, or services that we can give to everybody? Then there's going to be a subset of folks that are going to have moderate distress, but they don't meet a formal diagnosis. And so these are more of our community interventions. And then we have the traditional that you guys are used to, which is making sure that we have those supports to meet those that are have that diagnosable disorder, that are needing full treatments. So in that universal, one of the things that we've been really working hard on right now is that we know psychoeducation and addressing basic coping strategies are really important here. And so one of the things that children's books are one way that parents and kids can engage. My colleague and I wrote Trinka and Sam, The Big Fire. And if you go on YouTube, you'll actually see that Hawaii made a reading of the story. And it really goes into how do we talk to young kids about the fires that they experienced? What are some of these reactions or changes that might happen? But it goes to that hope piece on some of those improvements and that things can come back. Once I was very, very scared is another, goes into other events, not just a wildfire, but through animals and characters. Again, we can talk through helping kids to understand that we get what they're going through. We can also ask them, what animal do you feel like today? The elephant is one that's ashamed of its behaviors. And so you see this big elephant hiding behind a little tree. Or you see the dog growling because she's just so angry at all the changes that are happening. And each day, sometimes I feel like a dog, sometimes I feel like the elephant and ashamed. But it also goes into what coping kids and adults can use. The frog still likes to play. The rabbit likes to do its breathing exercises. So what kind of things do you want to do? And do you want to be like the rabbit or the frog today? And so sometimes we can use those efforts. There's a lot of psychoeducational materials, whether it's talking about grief and traumatic grief. Bounce Back Now is a mobile app that was created by colleagues from Medical University of South Carolina. That's an app for adults, both in English and in Spanish, that goes into what are some of these types of reactions we might experience after a natural disaster, and what are things I can do right now to help with my coping. We have also resources for educators, for other childcare professionals, and I'll say where our website is in just a minute. And the other part of Universal is that we, with the National Center for PTSD, which is part of the Veterans Administration, we actually have the most comprehensive idea about psychological first aid. Psychological first aid is one of these early interventions that are really appropriate for the now. We have an e-learning course that's for free, and you can see at the learnnctsn.org. You can go on there. We have about 8,000 completers every quarter that take this course. And so really what we're doing and what we outlined is that PFA talks about how do we connect with individuals in a meaningful and engaging way. It's not like they're showing up to our offices for mental health services. Many times we're in community events. We might be at a shelter. We might be going door to door. So how do we create that connection with them, help to ease that mistrust that might be there? But then also think about what are those things that might be going on for them right now. That safety I talked about. There's still a mistrust. Where should I be living? Am I going to be able to stay here? There's a lot of misinformation online that's really causing a lot of disruptions about is the air quality and environmental risks that are being talked about, is the choices I'm making truly going to be okay for my family, or are there long-term impacts? Helping to navigate and helping to support folks with safety, as well as that comfort. We need to pause and make sure those who have lost loved ones, those that lost all their possessions, their property, that loss, we need to be allowing them to tell their stories, help them to talk about what's going on, and give that kind of support right now, and making sure that is there anything else that they're needing. Many people that we work with in this kind of early interventions will not need stabilization, but some I've worked with, they might have just gotten news about something that's happened, and they might all of a sudden need some basic grounding. And so our stabilization is, what are those tools that we can have in our toolbox just to help to ground, to make sure that someone stays oriented. Because sometimes we're working in situations or environments that I can't all of a sudden rely on formal support systems because they might not be in existence right now. Information gathering is really trying to make sure that those that are doing this work, there are so many different needs. The intervention should be based on who you're working with, not because I'm some expert that knows what people want. So are they missing their prescriptions right now? Are they struggling with, I left with nothing and I'm supposed to report back to work and I don't even have black socks? What are those things that might be going on for them so that we can tailor the intervention to what's going on with them? And those needs are going to be changing over time. Our interventions also need to be changing. So whether it's dealing with those practical basic needs, helping them connect to those social support systems that actually have that, that healing effect, or is there helping them with some basic coping, whether it's helping them stay with their routines. Done a lot of discussion of being informed right now is great. Being overly informed with media and social media may be causing a distress, so sometimes we have to intentionally kind of pause on that. And always looking at, is there additional supports or services, whether there's connecting to FEMA for some of the additional services, or there are many different community groups that are doing things. Always thinking about, is there those connections that are happening? I do, and I have been asked about this. In this early phase, and we're still in this early phase, it's really critical that we don't pathologize people's distress right now. Distress does not equal pathology. There's so many that we're instantly trying to say that they need mental health treatment, when all of us have a little bit of distress in us. And so it's important right now, can we stick to getting them their supports, making sure that those basic needs are covered? Are they using some of their coping strategies? One tool, or kind of one suggestion that I heard from somebody of, is there a guide of what to know when somebody isn't okay? And I really love these kind of 4 basic principles that a colleague out of Israel kind of came up with. And one of them is like, how controllable are their emotions? Are they able to control their emotions right now? Or are their emotions controlling them? Do they have any ability to kind of censor themselves right now? Are they actually able to perform tasks right now? There's things that have to get done. Are they able to actually do those tasks in a meaningful way? Or are they so shut down that their functioning is not there right now? Do they have capacity for rewarding interactions when they do have that time of having warmth and meaningfulness of interactions? Are they able to have that kind of connection? And are they able to kind of hold on to their self-value of what they stand for, who they are in that positive way? And these sometimes are kind of good milestones of, do they need additional supports right now? Or is there additional coping that I might be able to help to give them so that they can kind of be okay in each of these categories? With California, we actually are pretty lucky. There has been a lot of investment in behavioral health across the country. I mean, excuse me, across the state. Sorry, I just, hold on. I'm sorry, I just hit this. And so one of the things, especially in this time when, because of policy changes that we're hearing with some groups, especially those who are Hispanic, who might be concerned about legal statuses, or even from the LGBTQ community, that they don't trust services right now. So CalHope is one of these services that we actually have in California that is anonymous, that does provide supports, and it is 24/7, and you are connected to trained providers. We also have a couple of digital mental health supports that are available for kids and families. So Saluna is an app for 13 to 25-year-olds. It is anonymous. You actually, it's kind of this one-stop mental health app. So there are tools in the app that you can get coping, but you actually can get one-on-one coaching and one-on-one support through the app. All of this is anonymous, and so a youth does not have to actually give any of their identity. Bright Life Kids is for parents and kids of 12-year-olds. So that one you do have to do provide an email. The rest is anonymous. But again, there is ability to have one-on-one peer support and one-on-one access to coaches right now, or mental health counselors. A few of us, so both at UCLA and at UC Davis, we are partnered with a group called Chorus, and we're creating a website called Together for Wellness. And our website is created for youth and their parents and caregivers. It's in 13 different languages. And our youth actually are the ones that actually bring the topics up. So they wanted topics on relationships and sexual wellness. We're working with them. They actually want to know what types of supports they need for immigration and knowing their rights, and on social justice issues. And so again, these are all options for folks from that tier 1 perspective that might need some supports. As we're moving forward, we're going to need to think about that tier 2. So one of the things that come into play after disasters is that there's going to be what's called the crisis counseling program, where counselors are going to be asked to come out into the community. I can be well trained, but I also know that with a mental health degree, there are many people that are going to not trust me, not trust the system that I'm connected to. And so Skills for Psychological Recovery was something that we created after Katrina. That's a community-based intervention that is for paraprofessionals, those community partners that we so invest in. How do we help to work with them to do some of this work out in the communities for those folks that might have moderate distress, but don't meet that level of needing treatments? And so Skills for Psychological Recovery, sometimes I can only have one shot with somebody. I only have that one visit. Sometimes we can have multiple, and that's great. But even in that one time, how can I make this the most meaningful investment that I can? And so just like with PFA, again, the intervention shouldn't dictate what we do. So we do need to do a little bit of info gathering of what is going on with them right now. What are some of those current needs and problems that are happening? Then we have to, is this something that they're needing to help with problem solving? Many times in disasters, our ability to problem solve diminishes, especially, or the problems get more challenging. So sometimes having some of these basic core skills in problem solving can really help with that brainstorming and thinking out of the box for addressing some of these issues that are going on. We know in disasters that, frankly, when so much is going on, we tend to remove those things that create well-being to give us that meaning that energizes us, that gives us the ability to connect with our emotions. So we actually have to help people with adding back in those aspects of well-being, or those positive activities of that family time, or all those things that can actually help us. As I was talking about earlier, reactions, especially to reminders, are a big part of disaster recovery. So helping people to cope when these reminders pop up in our lives, how to access different coping strategies can be really an important piece. And we know that over time, sometimes our thoughts might be actually stopping us from moving forward. I might be so focused on things that didn't happen in those early days that I keep focusing on that element, but then that prevents me from actually being able to start filing my claims for my insurance. And so sometimes you might absolutely be accurate in your beliefs, but is it preventing that recovery? And we know that sometimes we have to rebuild those social supports that are important. HATS is an intervention that we used in, that is a child component of how to do these activities in SPR in a child-friendly way. So we create dream catchers and treasure chests to show ways with kids from a really fun way of showing how they can recover and heal in this. I can't get into all of it, but there are those tier 3 interventions, and the state has poured investments in LA County to make sure that people are trained in cognitive processing therapy or trauma-focused CBT. If those are 2 interventions that you're not trained in, there are great online websites that they have that I have here that you can actually learn both about them. Trauma-focused CBT is a child adolescent intervention, and the cognitive processing is an adult intervention. So I just want to kind of wrap up my discussion that when we're doing this work, we really do have to think about ourselves. And that when we're thinking about ourselves, the Surgeon General and our former Surgeon General really kind of looked at what are those workforce mental health well-being components that we need to be thinking about. We do need to be making sure that we're protecting our workforce from that safety and security perspective? What are those things to make us all have that sense of belonging, even with everything that's going on right now? As much as possible, having that work-life harmony and really making sure that we're investing in having our workforce understand that their work is meaningful. And especially for those that feel like that's under attack right now, we need to make sure what's the institutions doing to protect their work, as well as help having these spaces to provide support right now. And I was saying that sometimes we're doing this work on the backdrop of other disasters. There's so many I've been talking to, even at UCLA, that are still kind of reacting from COVID, and that they feel like there's been one event after another. And so we do need to be thinking about how do we protect us as providers and responders who have experienced different disasters. And so there are different philosophies, including for those that are still struggling from whether it's been responding to some of the other events that have happened in LA or even COVID, do people need those additional supports in place so that they're the best selves that they can be, and maybe not hop on to doing wildfire recovery right now? It's important that we do those check-ins, that we support ourselves. This is going to be a long-term recovery that, frankly, all of us can fit into this the way they need to be. Really trying to, and I know there's an investment by the department of really thinking about what other supports that we can be doing, whether it's peer support and some of these kind of other initiatives that can actually help to strengthen us, so that we those that are needing those supports can be there. We already have in place stress reduction and coping activities, and our newsletter really kind of talks about those efforts. There's also those the ability to recharge, whether it's the garden that's there, or even just moments to come together, whether it's to work out or just having kind of that gathering. Those recharge kind of efforts are really, really important. What we're also going to be putting into place and more regularly and systematically is, can we have peer support circles, so that as we're kind of going through these, how do we have a space and a time that we can dedicate to ourselves, and thinking about how we can have peer mentors built into different departments, so that we can really kind of strengthen that peer support, and potentially having a buddy system. One of the things that we created during COVID is that we took a spin on PRN. So when you guys prescribe medications, that means for you as needed. So our PRN for our well-being is pause, reset, and nourish. And so when we're thinking about PRN for our well-being, what I'm asking you to do is, with that pausing throughout the day, take 3 breaths in at different points of time. Check in with, where are you holding that stress in your body? How is your mind feeling right now? Is it cluttered? Is it clear? And what's kind of going on with your feeling state? So that pause is, let's check in how we're doing. That R is reset. So I might have had a difficult interaction with somebody. I might have just heard about their experiences after the wildfire, but I have another meeting coming up where another person might be coming in. I want to be that same steady, confident person that I was for that last person for the next person. So what are those things that I can do in the moment? Is it taking a breath? Is it taking a moment and closing my eyes? Some of us work from home. I get to pet my cat. Sometimes it might be just looking at that leaf and seeing it going down the river and letting go of what just happened, and that I did the best I can. And that N is nourish. What are those things that we can do to really nourish and fill up our body, soul? Are we having those playful moments? Are we having times together outside of work to laugh, or even inside of work? But really celebrating these small victories. And I'm going to end, one of those things that helps me to nourish is this picture here is from Lahaina, and one of their elementary schools burnt down. And it was King Kamehameha that had a very strong, big history throughout of Lahaina. Just this long, it was just, I can't even capture what this school meant to this community. But we created a temporary school, and this was the first day of that temporary school, and the kids lined up, and they have an opening protocol. And just as the kids started to sing the opening protocol, that rainbow showed up behind them. And as they were singing, all of a sudden the whales behind, and I couldn't capture that in the image, but the whales started breaching behind them as they were singing. There was a couple events that week to open and bless this new school. And just as those opening sessions all wrapped up, the next day the whales all left. They actually migrated out. And so sometimes we have to look at those signs of hope, whether it's holding on to the rainbow, holding on to those things in those discussions that we have, because that can anchor us and help us to realize that what we're doing is so important right now. So I hope everyone thinks about your mental health as we're thinking about this long-term recovery. And some of the resources that I shared from the NCTSN, our website is here, as well as our e-learning course, so you can learn more about PFA or skills for psychological recovery. So I know that we kind of started late, so we don't have as much time for questions, but I got it in.
There's a couple of cute questions in the chat,
Okay,
so maybe we can just take one or two of them.
yes.
So I'll go ahead and read it for you aloud. So hello. Okay, so the first question is really just a general Q&A of highlighting the clinical contributions that the department are already or might be making to assist in the clinical needs for the LA community. And if you can comment on any research contributions that those of us with relevant skills can make. And is the department spearheading or participating in such initiatives under the UCLA banner?
So thankfully, we have such great, both the campus and the health systems. We have skill sets and expertise that's going to be needed not only in the short term, but into the long term. So as part of my wellness officer hat, and with Dr. Helena and some of her team, we are looking at how do we first tap into the expertise, the community groups that we already have in place. It is so critical that we don't create a plan that's contradicting how things already operate. We want to actually foster those community partners. We want to find out what their needs are and build upon them. And so part of what we've been doing is those of us that have partnerships, hearing what the needs are. So one of the needs was that some want to have a psychological first aid training. So the California Psych Association is sponsoring on Saturday a training for that, and we can be doing others. Other requests that have been going on would be some of the roles that questions that parents have as they're navigating. We also know for the long term, we have great expertise on suicide prevention, peer support in the initiatives. So mapping that and putting together so that there cannot be one person that does this, and it shouldn't be there. But at the same time, UCLA can't create a plan that is opposite from what's going on in the community. So all those things have to be aligned and synergized right now, which is what we're doing. So if there's folks that are wanting to get involved, you know, email me or email Dr. Hansen, and we're putting all the pieces together. We have some of the pieces, but we know we don't have them all.
One more question we'll ask, and you already actually started touching on this. A couple of people really wanted to hear more about the psychological first aid course. And so you started giving a little details of that, but if you could speak another minute on that.
Sure. So one option is we do have an online version. It gives you 5 CE credits. It's free. Our learn at nctsn.org has that course, and it also has that course SPR. And so what's important is that you can do it in your own time. Some have also wanted, and if folks email me, there is a training this Saturday that the Psychological Association is sponsoring, that we're doing it just in time. Okay, that's gonna get circulated. And I can imagine that there's also gonna be additional requests, so we can definitely make sure that we make some of those suggestions. So the manual is available in many, many languages on our website. And so sometimes that's also helpful for some of the diverse community groups that we're working with, that there are handouts in the back that are in many, many languages. So thank you.
That's all the questions we have. And thanks for everyone for joining. Thank you.